The doors of the Paul VI Hall opened just after noon on the 26th of June, 2026, and one by one in scarlet cassocks that seemed to catch every flicker of the overhead lights, the cardinals of the Roman Catholic Church began to file in. There were 178 of them that day, drawn from every continent, men who had crossed oceans and deserts and mountain ranges to sit inside this modern fan-shaped hall built beneath the shadow of St. Peter's Dome. Pope Leo XIV, the first American to wear the white cassock, walked among them without hurry, greeting men he had known for decades and men he had met only months before at his own election. It was his second extraordinary consistory in less than 6 months, and by every account it was meant to be a gathering of listening, of dialogue, of what the Pope himself would later call a communion carried out not alone but together. And yet, as the Swiss guards closed the great doors behind the final arrivals and the hymn Veni Creator Spiritus rose into the hall, there were chairs that stayed empty. Officially, the Vatican noted the absences the way it always does, with a quiet, almost clinical brevity. Unofficially, in the corridors outside, in the private conversations of cardinals who had travelled from Manila and Kinshasa and Munich, one absence in particular hung in the air longer than the others. It belonged to a 94-year-old man from Hong Kong who for nearly 2 decades had made it his personal mission never to miss a moment when the Universal Church called him to Rome. His name was Joseph Zen Zekiun, and on that June afternoon, for reasons that had nothing to do with politics and everything to do with the slow, unforgiving arithmetic of age, his chair remained empty, to understand why that single absence mattered more than the dozens of others recorded that day. You have to go back further than June 2026. You have to go back to a boy born in Shanghai in 1932, the son of a family that would soon watch its entire world collapse under the weight of revolution. Joseph Zen entered the Salesian order as a teenager, was ordained a priest in 1961, and spent the first decades of his ministry doing something that sounds almost unremarkable on paper. Teaching philosophy first in Hong Kong, then across mainland China itself, slipping in and out of seminaries at a time when the Chinese Communist Party viewed any contact with Rome as an act of quiet subversion. He was not by nature a provocateur. Colleagues who knew him in those years describe a careful, exacting academic, more comfortable with Latin textbooks than with protest banners. But something in Zen shifted as he watched year after year the way Beijing tightened its grip on the so-called patriotic church, the state-sanctioned Catholic body that operated independently of the Vatican and the way it treated the underground church, the millions of Chinese Catholics who remained loyal to Rome at enormous personal risk as a problem to be managed rather than a community to be respected. By the time Pope Benedict XVI made him a cardinal in 2006, 3 years after his term as Bishop of Hong Kong began, Zen had already become the loudest clerical voice in Asia, willing to say in public in English and Cantonese and Italian what many others in the Vatican preferred to whisper. He opposed the 2018 provisional agreement between the Holy See and Beijing over the appointment of bishops, with a bluntness that startled even his allies, warning that the deal would, in his words, hand the underground church over to a government that had never stopped persecuting it. He flew to Rome uninvited to try to meet Pope Francis before the agreement was signed, and was by his own account left waiting. He called the Vatican's chief negotiator, Cardinal Pietro Parolin, a man of little faith, a phrase that travelled through Catholic media faster than almost anything else he ever said. None of this made him popular inside the Roman Curia. It made him instead into something the Church has always struggled to categorize. An elder statesman who refused to soften with age, a man who seemed to grow more outspoken, not less. The older and frailer he became. Then came 2019 and the protests that convulsed Hong Kong for the better part of a year. Zen, already in his late 80s, appeared at demonstrations, celebrated masses for arrested activists, and helped establish a humanitarian fund to pay legal fees and medical bills for those swept up in the crackdown. When Beijing imposed its sweeping national security law on the territory in 2020, the fund Zen had helped create became a target. In May 2022, at the age of 90, he was arrested by Hong Kong police, accused of failing to properly register the charity and, more ominously, of colluding with foreign forces, a charge that in the language of the national security law can carry a life sentence. Photographs from that period show an old man in a black clerical robe leaning on a cane, walking into a courtroom with the same unhurried calm he had carried into seminary classrooms 60 years earlier. He was released on bail. The charges related to the fund's registration eventually resulted in a fine rather than imprisonment, but the larger national security investigation against him was for years never formally closed, leaving him in a kind of legal limbo that meant every trip he made outside Hong Kong required a court's explicit permission, and he kept making those trips. In January 2023, at 91, he petitioned a Hong Kong court to return his confiscated passport so he could attend the funeral of Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI in Rome, the Pope who had made him a cardinal. The court agreed. He flew to the Vatican, stood among the mourners, and returned home only to be hospitalized weeks later with breathing difficulties so severe that friends in Hong Kong felt compelled to publicly deny rumors that he was dying. He recovered. 2 years later, in April 2025, it happened again. Zen, now 93, went back to court to secure his passport so he could attend the funeral of Pope Francis, the man whose China policy he had spent nearly a decade publicly criticizing. He went, anyway. Age had taken his ability to vote in the conclave that followed, since cardinals over 80 are barred from that final decisive gathering, but it had not taken his determination to be present for the moments the Church considered sacred. Between funerals, he found time to attend the trial of Jimmy Lai, the jailed pro-democracy media mogul sitting quietly in the courtroom gallery, as a show of solidarity that required no speeches at all, just the fact of an old, frail cardinal choosing to be there. Which is what makes January 2026 such an important hinge point in this story, because it shows that even a few months before the empty chair, Zen was still fighting to be heard, and heard forcefully. Pope Leo XIV convened his first extraordinary consistory on the 7th and 8th of that month, the first time the entire College of Cardinals had assembled since his election the previous May. Roughly 170 cardinals gathered in the Synod Hall, working through themes that ranged from the implementation of Pope Francis's teaching on evangelization to the ongoing question of synodality, the emphasis on listening and shared discernment that had defined much of the previous pontificate, and that some conservative cardinals, Zen chief among them, viewed with real suspicion. According to reporting from that consistory, Zen delivered one of the most forceful interventions of the entire gathering, addressing Leo XIV and the assembled cardinals directly on his concerns about where the Church's structures were heading. For Zen, genuine consultation within the Church was part of its tradition, but he worried that what he called an attempt to reimagine ecclesial governance in more democratic terms, treating every baptized voice as interchangeable on questions of doctrine, risked repeating the fractures that split Western Christianity 5 centuries earlier. It was vintage Zen, theologically precise, historically anchored, delivered without a hint of diplomatic softening, and delivered in person by a man 3 months shy of his 94th birthday, standing or seated among cardinals decades younger than himself. He did not stay only for the formal sessions. Photographs and accounts from that same week show Zen, days after the consistory closed, still moving through Rome with his particular blend of frailty and defiance, later returning to Hong Kong to resume a schedule that would have exhausted men half his age, celebrating a Latin Mass that had itself become a flashpoint in internal Catholic debates over liturgy, holding a golden monstrance in hands that visibly trembled, and continuing to write on his personal blog under the recurring title Letter to Inmates, a phrase he had used for years to describe his solidarity with Hong Kong's political prisoners, men and women he considered in a spiritual sense his own congregation. Christianity Today profiled him around this time under a simple, almost startling headline, calling him the 94-year-old Hong Kong cardinal still fighting for Chinese freedom, and the piece made clear that whatever toll the decades had taken on his body, his convictions had not softened by a single degree. So, when the second extraordinary consistory was announced for late June 2026, There was every reason inside the College of Cardinals to expect Zen would find a way to attend court order or no court order, health scare or no health scare, the way he always had. This time, he did not. On the 25th of June, the day before the gathering opened, Vatican-focused reporting confirmed that 3 prominent cardinals would miss the consistory entirely due to health concerns: Joseph Zen of Hong Kong, Peter Erdo of Hungary, and Willem Eyck of the Netherlands. The explanation offered was simple and in its way unremarkable, the kind of line that appears in 100 Vatican news briefs a year. But for those who had watched Zen defy courts, national security investigations, and his own body for nearly 2 decades to be physically present at every major moment the Church asked of him, the absence read differently. It read like a threshold quietly crossed. The man who fought a legal battle to attend Benedict's funeral, who fought another to attend Francis's, who stood and delivered a pointed theological challenge to a sitting pope just months earlier, simply could not make the trip. This time, there was no scandal in it, no drama, no headline-grabbing confrontation. There was only an old man, thousands of miles away in Hong Kong, and a chair in the Paul VI Hall that nobody else could quite fill the way he would have. It is worth sitting with what the consistory itself was actually about, because the emptiness of that one chair takes on more weight against the backdrop of what Leo XIV was asking the cardinals to do together. Over the 2 days of sessions, the College of Cardinals worked through 4 broad themes the Pope had set for them: the wounds of a fractured world, the culture of power within and beyond the Church, the pursuit of the common good, and the practical implementation of the Synod on synodality that had consumed so much of Francis's final years. Leo sat with the cardinals through the plenary sessions rather than presiding from a distance, and cardinals were divided into small discussion groups seated at round tables. A deliberate departure from the older, more hierarchical seating charts that had defined consistories for generations. In his opening remarks, Leo told the assembled cardinals that his ministry could not be carried out alone, and he called on them to offer him frank and sincere counsel, rather than simply defending particular institutional interests. It was in essence an invitation to the kind of blunt engagement that Zen himself had modelled just months earlier, and one has to wonder what the 94-year-old cardinal watching from Hong Kong made of an invitation he was physically unable to accept. Leo XIV's language throughout his time as Pope has returned again and again to the idea of communion, the notion that a consistory is meant to be, in his own description, a place of shared belonging rather than a formality to be endured. At the close of his very first consistory back in January before Zen's June absence, Leo had already anticipated exactly this kind of moment. In his concluding remarks that day, he thanked the cardinals who had made the physical effort to travel to Rome despite their age, and then, in a line that reads almost prophetically against what would happen 5 months later, he added that he felt a particular closeness to those cardinals who for various reasons had not been able to be present. At the time, those words applied to a handful of scattered absences scattered across a college of more than 240 members. By June, they applied with unusual specificity to a man whose presence had for years seemed almost guaranteed by sheer force of will. There is a broader pattern here that the channel's audience will likely recognise because it echoes something true of every institution built on elderly leadership, the slow, uneven way that age finally catches up with even the most stubborn among us. The College of Cardinals that gathered in June 2026 was demographically a body increasingly defined by this tension. Out of 241 current members, only 178 made the January gathering, and the June session saw its own scattering of absences layered atop the ordinary attrition of illness and travel that comes with convening men from every continent, many of them well past 70. Cardinal Angelo Becciu's own status within the college remained at the time formally unresolved, a separate and unrelated complication that nonetheless underscored how unsettled the composition of this body had become under Leo XIV's young pontificate. Against that backdrop, 3 absences due to ill health might have passed unremarked. It was the specific weight of Zen's name on that short list that turned a routine administrative note into something worth pausing on. Because Zen was never simply another aging churchman marking time until his ministry quietly ended. He had spent the better part of 30 years positioning himself as the loudest institutional check on Vatican diplomacy toward Beijing, a diplomacy he believed, in his most stark formulations, was slowly suffocating the very underground church he had spent his priesthood defending. He criticized not one but two popes to their faces, or in public print, over the China question, an act of ecclesiastical daring that few cardinals of any age would risk. He turned an ordinary act of charity, raising money for arrested protesters, into a criminal investigation that hung over him for years without ever quite resolving into either conviction or exoneration, a limbo that would have worn down a much younger man. And through all of it, his answer to nearly every challenge, physical or political, had been the same: show up at the funeral, show up at the trial, show up at the consistory, and when you get there, say exactly what you believe, regardless of who is sitting across the table from you. That is precisely what makes the empty chair of June 2026 land the way it does. It was not a protest. It was not a boycott. There is no evidence, and this video will not pretend otherwise, that Zen's absence carried any political message beyond the plain medical reality of being 94 years old and increasingly frail after years of hospitalizations, breathing difficulties, and the accumulated physical cost of decades spent defying court orders, national security investigations, and the ordinary caution that most men his age would have long since embraced. If anything, the absence is more poignant precisely because it was involuntary, because it represents the one obstacle that Zen, for all his defiance, could not out-argue, out-litigate, or simply will. His way past courts can be petitioned, passports can be returned, governments can occasionally be shamed into granting an exception. A body that has simply run out of strength cannot be reasoned with. In the same way, Cardinal Peter Erdo, the Archbishop Emeritus of Esztergom, Budapest, and one of the most prominent canon lawyers in the modern Church, and Cardinal Willem Eijk, the Archbishop Emeritus of Utrecht, known for his own uncompromising doctrinal positions, were absent for the same stated reason, and their empty chairs matter too in their own right as markers of a College of Cardinals that is aging in real time under the pressure of a demanding modern papacy. But it is Zen's chair that the cardinals in that hall likely noticed first, precisely because his presence at every prior gathering had felt less like an obligation and more like a fixed point, something the institution could quietly rely on. When a fixed point finally shifts, even by a single gathering, even for entirely understandable reasons, it tends to register as something larger than the sum of its parts. What did Leo XIV do with that absence, practically speaking? The historical record so far suggests nothing dramatic, and that restraint is itself worth noting. There was no public statement singling out Zen by name during the June consistory, no ceremonial acknowledgement beyond the same general expression of closeness to absent cardinals that Leo had already extended back in January. The consistory proceeded through its 4 themes, its round-table discussions, its closed-door sessions on the wounds of a fractured world, and the temptations of institutional power without pausing for the kind of set-piece tribute that a documentary narrative might be tempted to invent. This video will not invent one either. What actually happened is quieter and in its own way more honest. 178 cardinals worked through 2 long days of discernment. The Pope moved among them without hurry, and somewhere in Hong Kong, an old priest who had spent his whole life insisting on being present followed the proceedings from a distance he could not close. It is tempting in telling a story like this to reach for a tidy resolution, the kind of ending that gives an audience permission to feel that everything worked out. The honest version of this story does not offer that. As of the consistory in June 2026, Cardinal Zen remained the retired Bishop of Hong Kong, still a member of the College of Cardinals, still publicly associated with his blog, and its recurring letters to the political prisoners, he considered his flock still by every account available alive and engaged with the concerns that had defined his priesthood for 6 decades. His absence from one gathering does not erase the intervention he delivered 5 months earlier, does not erase the funerals he fought court battles to attend, does not erase the decades spent insisting that the underground church in China deserved a voice loud enough to be heard in Rome. If anything, the empty chair throws all of that history into sharper relief, because it marks for the first time in years a moment when the man who always found a way simply could not. There is a version of church history, the kind told in official Vatican communiques, that will record June 26th and 27th, 2026, as Pope Leo XIV's Second Extraordinary Consistory, a gathering focused on synodality, the common good, and the wounds of a fractured world, attended by 178 members of the College of Cardinals,